Hello, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I want to give you all a warm welcome. I really appreciate everyone being here to enjoy this evening with Dr. Jalonne White-Newsome, who I'll talk a little bit more about later. But just briefly, my name is Kai Tran. I'm a second-year Master's of Environmental Management student here at Duke with a primary concentration in community engagement and environmental justice. I also serve as the graduate assistant for the Community Engagement and Environmental Justice Concentration Program. Before I continue with my remarks, I want to give I would just want to let you all know that there will be photography and the session is also being recorded. So if that is something that is uncomfortable or an issue for any of you all, please come to me after the event. You may also exit the room and join via Zoom if that's more comfortable for you. I also, to start, would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to the Nicholas School of the Environment's Dean's Office and the Duke Environmental Justice Network. Without their support, this event wouldn't have been able to happen. So really appreciate all of their support, both help, financial, and all the other things in between that made this thing happen. Before I begin by introducing our honorable speaker and event, I'd like to give a brief land acknowledgement. What is now Durham was originally the territory of several Native nations, including Tutelo and Saponi-speaking peoples. Many of their communities were displaced or killed through war, disease, and colonial expansion. Today, the Triangle is surrounded by contemporary Native nations, the descendants of the Tutelo, Saponi, and other indigenous peoples who survived early colonization. These nations include the Halawa Saponi, Band of Saponi, the Saponi, the Okinichi Band of Saponi. In North Carolina's Research Triangle is also home to a thriving urban Native American community who represent Native nations and communities from across the United States. Together, these indigenous nations and communities rank North Carolina as the largest Native American population east of Oklahoma. Tonight, we are honored to introduce you all to the visionary Dr. Jalonne L. White-Newsome. For this evening, she will speak on the environmental justice achievements of the Biden-Harris administration and pathways forward. Dr. Newsome will provide remarks on this topic, followed by brief moderated Q&A, and the remainder of the event will follow by an open Q&A, and we will all then leave to the public reception where there will be food for y'all in the circle tables near the bathrooms over there. We'll all move there, so we'll be pretty intuitive. For those of you that do not know, Dr. Jalonne L. White-Newsome, she, her pronouns, was appointed to serve in the Biden-Harris administration in June of 2022 and recently completed her public service as the first ever federal chief environmental justice officer at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Under her leadership, the Office of Environmental Justice delivered on President Biden's ambitious environmental justice agenda, elevating environmental justice work across the White House and federal agencies. Her work was pivotal in making critical initiatives like Justice 40 a reality throughout the federal government. A native of Detroit, Michigan, Dr. White-Newsome has tackled environmental challenges from a wide range of positions and perspectives, including in the grassroots environmental justice movement, environmental philanthropy, state government, private industry, and academia. Dr. White-Newsome earned a PhD in environmental health sciences from the University of Michigan School of Public Health, a master's degree in environmental engineering from Southern Methodist University, and a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Northwestern University, and a certificate in diversity and inclusion from Cornell University. Before joining the White House, Dr. White-Newsome founded and led Empowering a Green Environment and Economy, LLC, a strategic consulting firm that focused on transforming communities by using people-centered solutions to combat climate change, improve public health, pursue environmental justice, and advance racial equity, which she recently relaunched. This role followed her time at the Kresge Foundation, where she managed millions in grants for the pursuit of equitable access to clean water. Dr. White-Newsome's early environmental justice advocacy and research has focused on air pollution, climate-driven extreme heat and flooding, and improving the health of low-income and communities of color. She's been recognized nationally for her work over the past 3 decades and is frequently referred to as a passionate, caring, bold, and loving leader. Dr. White-Newsome is a lifetime member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and affectionately known as Dr. J. She remains most thankful to her main job, being a wife and mother to her daughters, Ariel and Jalonne. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Jalonne L. White-Newsome.
Good evening. Can y'all hear me? Yes. Awesome, awesome. Well, that's the first thing that's gone right. How are you this evening? Thank you for being here. I mean, I know it's like late for folks. Like, I give y'all extra credit. I'll tell your teachers to give you extra credit. First and foremost, it is so wonderful to be here in some slightly warmer weather. I will say that. I left my 10 degrees in Michigan, so thank you all for this beautiful weather. Thank you for the kind introduction. Had a chance to engage with some students a little while ago, and again, it just warmed my heart and inspired me. So thank you all for the work that you're doing. I also want to appreciate, as I often do, those that manage this facility, those that provide the food and the catering and keep this place wonderful and comfortable for you all to do this great work. So thank you for those that are behind the scenes that are making this space for us today. Your work, again, and the tech guys, tech gals, does not go unnoticed. So thank you. And thank you, Kai and Dr. Manuel, again, for the opportunity to be here and the invitation. Thank you for the land acknowledgement. As a dear ancestor told me a long time ago, that if we don't acknowledge where we've been, it's kind of hard to figure out where we're going. And so I think what's even more important than reading those words is the action that comes after that. So I hope, again, that this conversation will be about action and acting on, again, some of the elements in that acknowledgement. So there was, I think, a song that was playing when you entered this space. I hope, did you all hear any music? Okay, we can play it on the back end. Okay, so ignore that. That song that you will hear is by one of, I think, the greatest folks from North Carolina, musicians, artists, activist, Nina Simone. And she, again, had this song, I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free. And it's just a couple words that I want to say since you didn't hear it. I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say them loud, say them clear for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree that every man should be free. So we are in the month of February, albeit the shortest month of the year, but it is the month that we celebrate and acknowledge the contributions of African Americans to this country. So happy Black History Month to all of y'all that identify, that connect, and appreciate the contributions of Black folks who we know have sacrificed, again, blood, sweat, and tears, and often their lives for this country. I remain so grateful to be one of those beneficiaries that have had many paths plowed, roads cleared, and barriers broken down. So this little brown girl, the daughter of Joseph and Terry Lynn from Detroit, who's affectionately known as Biscuit and Lady J on the basketball court, could somehow be the only African American that graduated in her chemical engineering class at Northwestern University, the first woman to step foot in a plant in Fort Worth, Texas, about 25 years ago, because they had never had a woman go outside the office, particularly a technical person. And again, to ultimately spend some time in the White House, serving our country. So to my elders, to my ancestors, to my folks that came from Mississippi and Louisiana, I am eternally grateful. And other than being the mom of two wonderful daughters, JJ and Ari, it was amazing to serve as a political appointee under the Biden-Harris administration. The first African-American and Asian vice president, the first African-American chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, Brenda Mallory, and to be a part and lead the first Office of Environmental Justice. Again, to be a part of an administration that was committed to equity, addressing climate change, advancing environmental justice, and other critical initiatives was truly a divine destiny. And to be a part of a group of committed folks, my small but mighty staff, one person here, Amina, was a wonderful intern that shared the same values and passion and knew what true public service should be, was a dream come true. Now, I will humbly say we did some things in the time that we were in office. We weren't able to do everything. But I think it's important to keep in mind the accomplishments that transpired, particularly uplifting the work of our federal agency partners, some that are still fighting the fight as they are being targeted and forced out. So for those of you that might not have been aware, we did have an Office of Environmental Justice in the White House. Did most of you know that? I don't assume. Okay. So if you didn't, surprise. But let me tell you a couple of things that we were able to accomplish. And I will say, I'm not speaking to the slides. They'll just be rolling for a little while and then they'll eventually go away. But some of the tangibles, when we talk about President Biden's vision. So President Biden, again, signed Executive Order 14008 that set all this work in motion. And of the many items in that environmental executive order, it stood up the Justice 40 initiative. Again, this was the initiative that was prioritizing, again, communities that had been underinvested and overpolluted in, and making sure that federal resources got to these communities across the country. And I tell you, because of the hard work of our agency partners, we actually surpassed that 40% goal. It was actually closer to 70% of the funds that got to these communities and some communities that had never seen federal funds before. So that was a part of the president's vision, and we were able to achieve that. Now, the second executive order, EO 140196, revitalizing our nation's commitment to environmental justice for all, did a lot of stuff, but it gave us, which might not be too sexy for folks, but the first ever government-wide definition of environmental justice. We never had one. So this allowed us to, again, roll in the same direction. And what was most important is that it was really created and built by the input and the wisdom and the guidance from folks across communities with environmental justice concerns everywhere. And in that new executive order, it talked about cumulative impacts. It talked about climate change. It talked about accountability, things that added, I would say, the meat and potatoes to the Clinton executive order of 12898. We were also able to develop, with technical support across the Executive Office of the President, the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, better known as the CJS. Now, again, this was a geospatial mapping tool that our federal agency partners had to use. So it was no longer an excuse like, we don't know where to find communities with EJ concerns and that are overburdened. You got a tool, click on the map, right? And so, again, I say that in jest, literally, but that's sometimes the beer, like, we can't find anybody. No, right? So it was wonderful because it was not only used by federal partners, but by state and local governments and actually communities for advocacy. Now, the tool wasn't perfect. It didn't include race, and I hope folks understand why it didn't include race. That was very intentional, but it was a powerful tool to help us meet the goals of the Justice 40 initiative. When I think about developing the first environmental justice scorecard, I remember 20 years ago, I was talking about we need to track what the government is doing on environmental justice, and that actually happened. Again, because our federal agency partners dug in, collected the data to say how we are advancing environmental justice, civil rights, institutionalization of environmental justice. And we did a baseline, and then we just did an updated last July. Again, this was accountability, right? Never had that before. When I think about the Council on Environmental Quality and the two advisory bodies that we have the opportunity to work with, our White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, better known as our WEJAC, again, a group of over 30 presidentially appointed EJ leaders from across the country that basically told us what to do. So they created a set of formal recommendations on so many topics that we really took to heart and pulled that into our policy making. When I think about our White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council, our IAC, again, the group of dedicated federal employees, every agency had an EJ officer that helped lead this work and institutionalize the policies and push for it, align with their individual missions. That was amazing. When I arrived at the White House, we developed a new initiative called the White House Campaign for Environmental Justice. And really the whole goal was to make sure that we were actually connecting with community. And so community said, hey, we want you to come here and we want you to bring your federal friends and we want to have a conversation. So we had these opportunities across the country to really see what was happening, to bring a little bit of DC to different places and try and really make change. And then when you think about across the executive office of the president, all of the reports that we generated from climate resilience to, oh my gosh, education, to EJ science, data, and research. So many reports that I hope you all downloaded before they went away. Again, just a lot of stuff that we did and were able to do. And I would say one of the last events of last summer that we weren't sure was going to actually happen was our Environmental Justice Summit in action. And again, this was the first EJ Summit that the White House had ever held. And it was an opportunity for folks to, again, attend virtually, some folks in person, but really to talk about the progress that we had made, but also the stuff that we still needed to do. And so that, again, was a very intergenerational celebration. It was amazing. And again, that was something that we were able to pull together to really think about how we're going to continue to address the gaps and challenges if we were to get another 4 years. So I just want folks to sit with that for a minute. I think now more than ever, we realize how blessed we were to be able to do this work in an environment at the top levels of government that actually, in many ways, cared about people and shared the same values and principles. And what I don't want to not acknowledge is the work that happened behind the scenes, some of the intangibles that really made, again, this legacy solidified. So when I think about the fact that environmental justice was no longer an afterthought in the White House and in our conversations, it came up. We talked about it. It was a question before we approved any policy. That is not normal, right? So making sure, again, that EJ was a part of the conversation. We made sure that the White House became really the people's house, that people had access that had never before went to the White House or connected with folks. That is something when you talk about environmental injustice, that lack of connection or access is major. And we tried to mitigate that. When I think about the words and comments and wisdom from our White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council members, our WEJAC, those comments shaped much of the policies that we created. So we didn't pull them out of box. We didn't create them in our ivory tower. It was from the voices of folks that we heard from across this country. And again, when I think about the relationships between our federal agency partners and communities that were built, the folks that rely on us to do our job, those are relationships that will not shift because of an administration. They will stay. Now, even in the midst of progress, we knew as a team that it was always the possibility that it could be taken away. And it's been, if I'm counting correctly, 15 days since January 20th. And that possibility is now reality. So between you and me, as I've told a lot of folks, the first 5 days, I didn't turn on my TV. I didn't look at social media. That was very intentional. If it wasn't Netflix, it probably wasn't on. And I would say, despite my attempts to like decompress after my official last day on January 20th, taking a step back was kind of impossible. The flurry of new presidential actions and executive orders that ignited this smattering of disbelief and confusion and analytical chaos seemed a little bit unreal. The next several days didn't disappoint. So many conversations, text messages, connections, talking to reporters in moments of grief with my former staff was very real. The panic level continued to elevate, particularly from community-based organizations that were depending on federal funds that had been temporarily frozen. Getting a frantic call from my mom in Detroit, who has funds for our daycare centers and child development that were frozen. Again, so many folks were scared. And I didn't want to believe that so many of our dynamic federal agency partners, our EJ champs, were now in the line of fire and being targeted for carrying on what we all know public service should be, and that is to serve. And then just last Friday, 5:00 p.m., getting a message that all websites will be taken down and sending out frantic texts and emails to my community partners and folks that I know care about this work. Again, changing and telling folks to take off their pronouns and anything with equity and environmental justice. I mean, basically trying to erase any trace of the Biden-Harris administration environmental justice legacy. And I just found out that there's a website that blackballs all of the Biden-Harris political appointees. Again, anybody that's been associated with the work, don't hire them. A nice little website that talks about that. But again, it has been a lot. And we just need to take a collective deep breath. Because when I think about and the things that I'm so thankful for, particularly in these past 15 days, have been the folks that have continued to work. It's been our lawyers that have been stepping up and defending our folks across this country. It's been our federal agency union leadership that are fighting for the rights of our federal employees and trying to clarify confusion and hold our government accountable. But I'm going to be real. You know, as we move into February, a little bit deeper, there are two questions that are at the top of my mind, and maybe yours too. The first being, how do we prepare for the next, I think it's 1,440 days? And question two, will environmental justice survive? So for me, the answer to both of these questions is steeped in one word, and that's legacy. And when I think about legacy, again, I think about my daughters. I think about one is a junior in high school, attending a school grounded in social justice principles. I think about my other one that's in upstate New York. And I think about, and I say to my husband frequently, I hope we've done it right, that we are producing some productive, caring citizens of this world that will serve their communities in whatever way. So that is the legacy that I'm most concerned with. But we know that legacy can mean different things to many different people. It could be about monetary or assets or one's faith or core beliefs. It could be one's character and reputation, how you lead your life, and who you influence and impact. Legacies can be the pathways for the future generations because we know it's the decisions that we make today that affect the future that we leave behind. In fact, the Latin word for legacy is legutum, which comes from the word and means to appoint by last will or send as an ambassador. And in the environmental justice movement, we have been a strong legacy spearheaded by many ambassadors, particularly some I've been blessed to know and work with in this great state of North Carolina. And I'm not going to call any names because I'm not going to get in trouble by leaving somebody out, but you know who you are. But what gives me hope is that we have this amazing opportunity, despite what has happened in the last 15 days, to continue to build on a very strong environmental justice legacy set forth by the Biden-Harris administration. And we've been here before, y'all. Do you know that? We've been here before. We don't have to spend too much time on Google or, as my daughters tell me, Chat, GBT, whatever it is. Or if you're like me, I go to the library and I pull out an encyclopedia. Check that out. To understand. I am so old school. But, you know, you can do any of that and understand there have been many efforts. In fact, government sanctioned efforts that have been used to eradicate the history and legacy of Indigenous and Black and Brown people. Do you agree? Yes. I think about, again, the U.S. Indian Board and Schools program, a century-long concerted effort by our federal government to destroy Native American culture and assimilate Native children through a network of residential schools, one of the most destructive assimilation policies in American history. I think about the 246 years of forced enslavement of our African brothers and sisters stolen from their homelands, deemed to be a fraction of a person, and the federal government's complicitness with letting the economic case of slavery override humanity. The reality of our government's policies on redlining, the practice of denying people access to credit because of where they live, even if they're personally qualified for loans, knowing that historically, again, core urban neighborhoods and Black populated neighborhoods were targeted. And even environmental racism, driven by a lack of enforcement, bad planning, the undervaluing of certain people, the intentional unengagement of the folks that would be impacted by decisions, this perpetual form of racism that has its own unhealthy legacy has caused sickness and death and made some communities uninhabitable. So whether we're talking about boarding schools, enslavement, redlining, or environmental racism, in my mind, these have all been government-sanctioned policies and tools created to destroy legacy. Racism, erasure, death, and dictatorship, all tools we have witnessed across the decades to eradicate a people. a culture. And I realize there are a lot of smart people in this room, and I'm confident we understand the tool and tricks of the enemy. And so now I want to spend some time talking about how we sustain a legacy. How do we sustain a legacy, particularly the legacy of environmental justice in this country? So by show of hands, and to make sure that you're still all awake, how many of you hopefully agree that we cannot let our legacy be erased by racism, by fear, by uncontrolled power? If you agree, raise your hand, raise both of your hands, put your fist in the air, whatever. All right. And I know our Zoom folks may not be able to see the room, but I don't see a hand down. So I guess I'm in the right room, so I'll keep on talking. So there are 5 actions that I believe are critical to sustaining the environmental justice legacy and the progress made on environmental justice from our last administration. So the first is to map the plan for the movement. The second is to muster the makers of the movement. The third is to memorialize the evidence of the movement. The fourth is to maintain the infrastructure of the movement. And the fifth is to mend the movement. So I'm going to talk about each of those briefly. The first, when we talk about mapping the movement, we knew, if you care to read, the implications of Project 2025. As I said to someone yesterday, we need to start talking about our Project 2029 and our Project 2033. It is our job to build the case for justice, convincing those folks, traditional, non-traditional, that EJ principles should be a part of everything that we do. And we have to make sure that that's pushed down to the state and local levels, that environmental justice and equity is not an option. So how do we plan now for this reconstruction? What are the lessons that we are learning in real time right now that we were not prepared for in this transition? How do we keep the movement moving beyond the federal government? Those are the questions that many of you in this room and maybe in the virtual space are asking. So I'm gonna make it real. When you think about your transition as a person, a lot of folks shy away from like planning, putting together a will and a testament, like that's important to do, right? So we don't want to think about our death, but it's important that we do, because you have to plan for the worst. And if you use the plan, great. If you don't, it's all right. But as we think about that planning, you get some clarity on some things that are important. When you think about the legacy and the folks that are going to live behind, you figure out in that will and testament who's in charge, where the resources going or coming from, who's managing the assets, and how they want their power and resources to be distributed. So again, as we witness in real time all the efforts by this current administration to cause a death to democracy, a death to freedom and justice, we got to start now mapping out that strategy for multiple future scenarios for that next transition, so this work and the progress that we made can live on beyond us. And so we cannot get caught off guard. And so when I think about you as students and professionals in this room, when you think about the assets that you all have, the experience, the data, the wisdom, whatever, you have to be ready to figure out what is your role in advancing this EJ legacy. And you have to start thinking about that now. So for 2029, you are ready to rock it out. Okay, so that's the first piece. The second piece is we need to muster the movement. On Saturday, my youngest daughter and I, JJ, we went to an underground railroad experience. That is not an amusement park. The historic First Congregational Church in Detroit, Michigan, was one of the many places that gave passage to enslaved peoples to get to Canada. And this church has created this experience in the basement that basically takes you through getting from the South to Canada as you were an enslaved person. And the pastor of the church provided some context for this experience, this transformation of this basement into like literally forest and rivers. And, he said, so many things happen on this experience that many people don't appreciate and realize. And I said that because as many times as I've heard the story of the Underground Railroad, I learned some stuff. A couple things. Collaboration. What I did not know was that it was Black folk, white folk, indigenous folks that made the Underground Railroad successful, this expansive network that operated. Amazing. The courage people had. When you're talking about enslaved folks that were leaving something that they knew because they knew it was something better. They had traveled to places that they had no idea where they were going. They had their children. They were being hunted by dogs and bounty hunters, and even got to see some folks that got caught, brought back to the plantation. So you had to have courage, the creativity. Our African ancestors had such unique solutions to address an insurmountable problem. They developed hand codes and signs and allies to navigate through the wilderness, sang spirituals, threw down black pepper to kill their scent from the dogs. That is engineering at its best. And they were tired, but they mustered up and prepared for battle, willing to put their lives on the line because they hoped for a different legacy. And so when you think about folks like Harriet Tubman and Harriet Beecher Stowe and Frederick Douglass and many named and unnamed conductors and allies of this network, they mustered up folks in a way that kept that movement and legacy alive. And when I think about the mustering of folks that's needed for this movement, I think about the sanitation workers striking in Memphis, Tennessee with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I think about Miss Dolly and the other folks that were in Warren County, North Carolina, that ignited the EJ movement. I think about those that catalyzed the Black Lives Matter movement. I think about Ida B. Wells and the brave women of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated that showed up and showed out during the Women's Suffrage March in 1913 in DC. I think about many of my friends in philanthropy and foundation that stepped up during the height of the COVID pandemic to make sure that communities and people were cared for. So again, we must muster, assemble, and literally prepare for battle, a battle to keep our legacy alive. And I need each of you to commit to whatever it takes to muster folks for this movement. All right, are you still with me? Okay, all right, number 3. We must memorialize the evidence of the movement. Now, 4 years from now, folks are going to ask, what happened? What happened under the last administration? We don't have a website. We don't have a report. We don't have anything, right? We don't have story. Right. So we got to make sure that we captured the proof that something did happen. So when you think about the stories, the records, the data, the websites, all those we need to hold on to. And we did a decent job of that, making sure that our external partners had them. But again, it's more than that. It's about tracking the seeds that were planted in the previous administration. Billions of dollars went out across this country. Do y'all know that? More money than ever to advance environmental justice. I don't think I say that enough. It was unknown. So when we think about even just the monies from the Justice 40 Initiative and where they landed in communities across this country, we need to track the seeds of growth from that. What is going to happen? What's going to be different in communities across this country, regardless of what the federal government is doing? The seeds that were planted, they're going to grow. So how do we make sure that we track that we understand the impact of investment in communities, again, that have been overburdened and underinvested in and forgotten? We've had organizations that have gotten money for the first time. How do they continue to grow and mature? So again, we have to make sure we track and record how that game has been changed. Now, the previous White House was in many ways what we tried to say was the people's house. And we created spaces to convene and bring people together. We had so many summits on education, climate, and everything. And again, this was a way to document that progress. Let's make sure that those relationships that were made in those convenings, whether they be virtual or in person, that they are maintained, that we continue this larger body, again, of work and people that is going to be important for moving this movement forward. So again, I think about the tools, the CGIS, the scorecard, all those things we cannot forget. We can continue to use at the state and local level. So that evidence is important. And so again, we have to make sure that we keep it alive. So when we have our chance again, we don't have to start from scratch, but we can build on the legacy that was left. Fourth, we must maintain the infrastructure for the movement. And that infrastructure is people, it's policy, it's practice. How do we do that? Again, policy is so important. Again, an example, many of the recommendations that the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council made, the WEJAC, can not only be used at the federal level, but can be used at the state and local level. So I encourage you to get those recommendations on so many different topics and see how you can activate them. See what gaps there are in research that you can dig into when you're supporting community organizations across this country. I mean, the frameworks are there. Use them. When I think about the people, unfortunately, they're going to be possibly a lot of federal employees that are being pushed out, but they have so much knowledge, so much passion. How are we making sure that we have places for our federal brothers and sisters to land? And how do we use them at the state and local level to move this work in a way that, I think would be even more connected and more impactful? So we have these folks that are coming and still ready to work. So that is an infrastructure, that wisdom that we don't want to forget. And then when I think about the buildings and the physical infrastructure, we have museums, we have community organizations, we have community spaces that we need to make sure that we maintain to continue to tell the story. Now, in terms of practice, this is where I would say, so excited, because as I said before, and I said to folks, and I'll probably keep on saying this, environmental justice didn't start with the federal government, and it won't end with the federal government. So our practice is that we need to have every institution in this country step up, right? So when I think about state and local governments, they are on the front lines of protecting folks. EJ is local. So again, use the tools that we develop at the federal level, at the state and local level. Use that knowledge. That's important. When I think about our corporate partners in private industry, some that might be trying to backslide and not have so many sustainability goals or EJ goals, we have to hold them accountable and keep them from backsliding. It is a value to equity, a value to justice, and we have to build a better case for that. Philanthropy. Again, we cannot afford to back off now. Those same organizations will need the same levels of support. We're actually going to need philanthropy more because we're going to need them to step into the gaps. Again, the last administration, we put out billions of dollars, but we need folks to build on that, both our foundation partners and our corporate partners. And last but not least, academia. Mm-hmm. You can't get scared. Continue to make progress, continue to track your numbers, to continue to make sure that this community represents the broader community, that you're tackling the issues and questions and concerns of the folks that, again, maybe don't have the opportunity to matriculate in an institution like this. So important. So it's not the time to let our infrastructures crumble. We can't get scared. We gotta maintain it to keep the legacy alive. And last but not least, we must harness our ancestral power to mend the movement. And I say that because our ancestors are evidence that we will survive. Do you know that? Do you feel that? I hope so, because we will not be erased by a shift in administration. I firmly believe we're going to come back stronger. And I hope you believe that too. So again, we must all be ambassadors for the environmental justice movement. Again, for this legacy to continue, we have to map the movement. We have to muster the movement. We have to memorialize the evidence. We have to maintain the infrastructure, and most importantly, mend the movement. Again, using the power of our ancestors. And again, I will end. I'm not going to sing it, but in the words of another great North Carolinian, I think, George Clinton, one nation under a groove, getting down just for the funk of it. One nation, and we're on the move. Nothing can stop us now. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jalonne White-Newsome. We are now going to move to a moderated Q&A for some questions that were submitted by folks beforehand, and then we will open it up to an open Q&A with everyone. So get these chairs over here. So you touched on some of the amazing work that your team, the administration, was able to accomplish in the time that you were there at the White House. Among all the great work that you were all able to advance for environmental justice, what was an achievement or body of work that you are most proud of? I know that might be hard to singularly identify, but if there's a few things or one thing that you really remember back to and hope to have as your legacy, you'd like to describe.
Yeah, so I talked, that's what bullying means. Can you all hear me now? All right. I mean, I ran through kind of the litany of, I would say, tangible outcomes and deliverables that were guided by President Biden and Vice President Harris. So EJ scorecards, sieges, things of that nature, super important. But I think the thing that sticks with me is really the shift in, I would say, the culture of understanding that we cannot approach environmental justice in the way that we approach other things. It takes a different level of sensitivity, a different level of care to do that work, and I would say, and respect the principles of environmental justice within the federal government. So, for example, if we're going to have a conversation with community, we shouldn't really be setting the agenda. It should be set by the community. If we're going to have a meeting in community, it probably, shouldn't be maybe at a government building. We should be going into the community. When we create policy, we shouldn't already come with something fully baked, but it should be the input that we receive that helps shape the thing that we work on together. The other thing is, we're gonna, as the government, we have to acknowledge, which is why I intentionally shared those things that, again, government sanctioned policies that really have contributed to erasure and all these pieces. We have to acknowledge that. And I think, again, President Biden, I think, was kind of the first president to actually acknowledge, again, the piece with the Indian boarding schools, but holistically, we have to acknowledge and be okay and humble ourselves that we didn't always get things right. And I think there was this awareness in the time that I was there that we can't just treat EJ as another policy check the box. Now, again, we weren't perfect. There were still things that got me fired up every day. But the fact that we had people within the White House, we had an Office of Environmental Justice. I had a staff that made sure that every policy from every agency or across the executive office, we asked the hard questions about environmental justice. We didn't let it just slide. And I give so much credit to my staff for that.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that all right? Okay. They just hear this voice. Okay.
So thank you for that. To that point, many would say that the inclusion of environmental justice at the White House during your tenure was a monumental recognition of a movement that should say was historically left out of Washington. What did it mean to you and your constituents? What did people convey to you, the feelings that inclusion had for holding space for folks that hadn't always had a place in an institution like the White House?
I mean, when you talk to EJ elders, I mean, folks that have been in the movement 50 or 60 years, it's what they've been saying all the time. So, I mean, it was just like a validation of, yeah, this is what Should have been done a long time ago. So, I mean, I think and I was sharing this before, like people, in my humble opinion, just want to be heard. They want to be recognized and acknowledged that, the life and the struggle and the things that they're dealing with in some communities that were not thought of their own, is real and people care. And so I think that's, having an Office of Environmental Justice for the first time in the White House was a little bit of acknowledging that this stuff that I've been fighting for the past 40 or 50 years of my life is actually a big deal. And I don't want to discount EO 12898, the Clinton executive order. That was a great start. But EO 14096, revitalizing our nation's commitment to environmental justice for all, put the meat and potatoes on that. And so again, it was just, I think, just a validation of what we've been hearing from communities for a long, long time, that it's important enough. It should have been at the level of the White House a long time ago.
Great. You touched on this a little bit in your remarks, but for folks, a lot of people here are in academia or at a university. What role should institutions like Duke or other places of higher education play in the environmental justice movement?
I mean, a little bit of what I've heard today and the things that you all are doing. I mean, supporting community work, being good partners, shaping and informing policy with real data, continuing to make sure that the work that you're doing beyond these walls, you're having that same advocacy inside these walls. So, I find it very interesting where you have some organizations that are supposed to be focused on social justice and environmental justice, and they do great work on the outside. But if you look inside the organization, if you take a look in the mirror, oftentimes those same values are not exhibited. So how are you making sure that the work that you're doing beyond to fight and advocate and support communities with environmental justice concerns, that you're making sure that the same equity, that the same justice, that the same things are happening here within your institution? And that can look like curriculum, that can look like the students that are here, that can look like the conversations you have. Are there policies that are unintentionally inhibiting the creativity and the courageousness that you need within an academic institution? So I would say that's what you can do. Continue working on the outside, but make sure that you're checking yourself.
Great. And for those of us that are students here, is there any word of advice that you'd give to a student who is about to embark on a career either involved with or in environmental justice?
Oh, leave your ego at the door. Be humble and do a lot of listening. And I think, oh boy, folks, communities have a lot to teach you, and being open to that is so important. That's my advice.
Thank you. Well, to give time for everyone here, I want to open it up to Q&A. So folks in the audience, if you have a question, we'll pick on you, and we ask that you please press the button on the chairs that'll open your mic.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. This talk gave me goosebumps. It's really moving. My question is, how do you communicate with people who don't agree with you?
Like, that's the question. What's your name? I'm sorry. Emily, thank you. I think we are all human. And I think sometimes we lose that. And I really feel like we owe each other a lot of grace. And the way that I maybe communicate, and I'll say it in a different way, folks that I think are missing something and might not see or understand the issue because they have a different perspective. They've had a different experience and they might not appreciate, what I'm pushing or my hope dealing, as I call it. And so I think about that as an opportunity to educate and plant a seed. I'm not a big debater. That's just not me. I feel like, you know, even if, for example, I was given this example before, I was lobbying on the Hill in DC. How many folks would I have a conversation with that one had no idea what environmental justice was, really didn't care, that was not their agenda, So again, I'm not one that's going to beat folks over the brow like you have to, agree. That's not helpful. What's important is that you really try and understand where that person is coming from. Try and understand what they value and what they care about. And then figure out a way to connect with them as a human, as a person. And then I think if we do more of that, then our agendas or the things that we're trying to do can eventually be a product of that. They can become aligned. But I feel like, am I going to convince? I mean, I remember when I was a very young engineer and it was that whole profit over people thing. Like, we have our bottom line. You're here to make sure we're producing X amount of widgets, deal with it. I don't want to hear about, your environmental stuff, right? So how do you convince someone where they see value in something else and not value in where you see it? And you have to show them. You have to, again, give them space and time to get to that place and really understand, like, what is it that this person values? Okay, if it's the bottom line, then how do I show you that by actually managing the waste, by actually taking care of the community that you have a big footprint in, can actually benefit you more. Your reputation can cost you. If we have to deal with the, management of waste that we could have dealt with better up front, that costs you. So really, again, connecting with folks as humans, understanding their perspective, where they're coming from, what they value, and in really building the case is the way that I've tried to not only communicate, but also get things done with folks that, are just maybe totally different and don't agree.
There we go. Dr. J. Jalonne, I just want to honor you in this moment. I'm very, very familiar with your work. And as you mentioned, legacy, one, I want to thank you for the charge to re-galvanize us here and the students here at Duke for this environmental justice movement. You and I both have worked with organizations in New York City, like We Act for Environmental Justice, where our leaders, as if you will, the Peggy Shepherds of the movement, and the Cecil Corbin Marks, rest his soul, and the partnerships that we partner with. And so I want to thank you. I think when I had come on to We Act in the New York office and you were running the DC office, but to see you move the trajectory to which you have to end up at the White House as an inspiration to me. I was still in the New York office. You went on to Kresge, then to the White House. And now me having relocated from New York to this area and meeting you here tonight and to hear this, like everything that Peggy and Dr. Bullard and all the work that they have done, and it almost feels as if it's being ripped apart now. And it's unbelievable to think that we are in a moment of time to see the EJ movement appearing to be shattered, but it's not as long as we continue to hold on to that fight. And so to the generation of students here, I came here to meet with who was my first advisor during my doctoral studies, Dr. Jim Zhang, who's here, and meeting his current students. And I was his student almost 20 years ago. I don't want to date myself. I
You're
don't,
only 20. You're only 20. I say the
but
same
to
thing.
you, hats off to you, and I honor you for that work. And one of the things that I would like to say to the students here is, while you are an academic, I wore many hats. I was the chemist in an environmental lab. I was the one concerned about environmental exposures. I shifted to community engaged and nonprofit work. Don't be afraid to engage in the civic process. It does take a fight. It does take a movement of people power. And although we may be different or look different, environmental hazards have no boundaries. It has no color bounds. My exposure or someone's exposure, because not in my backyard, you cannot put a toxic, that political will. It's like we have a new political will now. We have to regalvanize a new political will to move this needle. And while I look at this photo and I see Peggy in there and I see Beverly Wright in there somewhere, and I recognize they are of age. It's not the same Peggy who was on the streets of the West Side Highway, arm to arm, fighting for toxic dumps in New York. But it's you. You're that next legacy. It's myself, it's everyone here. And so while we may sit at different sides of the table, it will take a galvanization of people in academia, in government, not being afraid to put the pressure on government. We have a lot of pressure to put back on government now, so that all the work of the past years will not be erased. So I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge you. And I appreciate you having been here, and I appreciate this audience, and I appreciate you all giving her your attention. And so onward and upward, we have a fight ahead of us. And so the students here are the next generation of environmental advocates. And so I just wanted to say that.
I appreciate you. And I'll just say one thing, and then I want to acknowledge this hand, that just because the federal government has shifted doesn't mean that they don't need to hear our voices. So there are still processes, there is still the Federal Register that you can, again, make public comments. So don't get quiet. Don't get quiet. But thank you. Thank you for your work.
Yes, again, thank you for being here. I think everybody was speaking out that you were coming. Well, and going back to what you mentioned about Warren County, the EJ movement was built decades ago from just people and low-income folks who have less wealth, less quote-unquote power than the rest of society, honestly. And that kind of makes us think like the EJ movement can be cyclical, like it's getting reborn through this loss that we're having. So what's next for you? What is kind of being reborn in your world? And maybe working on some new ventures, and what's sort of exciting you in the coming months?
Yeah, well, I tell you, my plan was to decompress, and that has not happened. So I know, like, I'm working on it. The end of this month, I am actually, I'm going away for at least 3 or 4 days, but that's a lot for me. But I mean, oh boy. I was telling some folks, like, again, these past 15 days have been very hard. When you see the work that you've supported and done just kind of wisp away, and that's a lot. But I guess what I'm excited about is, one, my former White House staff. We are still connecting and meeting, and we are plotting and planning. So I'm excited about that. And so just because you kicked us out the White House doesn't mean we can't do the work. So that's one thing that I'm really excited about. And I would say the second thing, and this is where kind of my new adventures and, I think how and what can I do to make sure that our local and state governments and our corporations don't use this as an excuse to go back to the way things were. So I am all about accountability. I'm all about how do we not backslide? How do we build the case for EJ? Even if it's not the federal government, EJ is local, right? So that is where my energy is going to be spent. I'm not, again, we have to do some defense. We have great lawyers out there for that. We have community organizations that are already plotting and planning, right? But my thing is what are the institutions that we need to keep moving in the right direction? And I feel like just because of the experience that I've had in private industry, the experience that I've had in state and local government, that's where I want to spend my energy. So 4 years from now, when I talk about that project 2029, we are going to have the business case as to why we can't go back to wherever we end up in these next 4 years. Like we have the case for justice. And so that is what I'm excited about. That is what I'm going to spend my energy on. And of course, being, I don't have lawyers telling me what to say now. So whatever way I can incite anything, and just being a help to communities across this country in whatever way. It's going to take, as you said, it's going to take all of us. And so again, as you think about 2025 and what are the skills, what excites you, what are you going to dig into? Because it's going to be the culmination of all the little efforts that are happening that are going to get us ready for 2029. And so that is what I'm probably going to spend my time on. And I might be having an adventure in an academic institution. And so getting back to doing some research, that again, applied research I've never done. Even my doctoral work, it was not research for the bench, it's research for the world and how we change stuff. So, we'll see what happens. Still figuring it out.
I think we'll have time for one more question and then we'll have to wrap this up.
Okay.
I just want to echo everyone's thanks. I can't really express how much I needed to hear, not just what you said, but how you said it. So thank you for helping contextualize this moment and for the work that you've done. I'm Ian Hitchcock. I'm an alum here. And I want to ask you about one of the factors I think that's critical to EJ work that's hard to see, but hard to make progress without, and that's trust. A lot of what you describe, the practices you talked about of, incorporating voices before you make policy or trying to meet people literally where they are, all strike me as exercises in building trust. And I think we are in a moment now where many of those organizations that were maybe first-time federal grant recipients have to be wondering if that trust has been broken or violated based on what we're seeing. And given what you've done, the approach you bring to the world and the relationships you have with these communities, how do we go back to either creating different avenues for trust or rebuilding an environment where trust and hope in progress can persist at all?
And what's your name?
Ian.
Ian. Thank you for that question. And I talk a lot about, and I say this all the time, the importance of relationships. And, right now, I would imagine that there are a lot of folks that really don't trust the federal government. That's just, that's my thought. I could be wrong. And they have a reason why. And so I think it's important for us in this moment. And I think the only way that we're going to get beyond this moment and get beyond the grief and the hurt that many people are experiencing and will continue to experience, unfortunately, is that we have to be in community, like supercharged community. And again, and I'll just speak from my experience, the White House was a vessel to bring different folks together, to create different policy, to kind of build these things. we can take those things outside of the White House. And just because that vessel, the White House, is broken, in my humble opinion, and is breaking trust, doesn't mean that we can't rebuild it and continue to reconnect and reconstruct outside of that vessel. So for me, the trust was not in the White House. The trust was in the people doing the work. So what I tell and said probably at every public meeting, this is not a job for me. It's my ministry. I got to go back to the streets. I got to go back to where I'm from. My accountability is always to the people. When you hired me, you knew that. I'm not going to sugarcoat anything. So to me, the trust is in the people. And we had some good people that are outside of the White House infrastructure now, where we can still continue to build that community and fortify it and get ready for whatever we're going to do next. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I want to say that while we have to wrap up this conversation, the conversation does not end here. And that I was in a conversation with one of Dr. Jalonne White-Newsome staff members back in October, and I made an errant remark like, oh, well, the narrative of this event will change if the presidency is changed and EJ work stops. And she quickly corrected me and said, EJ work doesn't stop on January 20th. And I think similar to that, I don't want these conversations to stop. So, and great excuse, there is going to be some food out there, so you can continue those conversations outside if you'd like. But I'll finish this event by playing some Nina Simone that I apologize with.
Either one.
Yeah. Or
we got to get hype. We got to get hype with hope.
But thank you all for being here.